On the evening of the 23rd of July, 2011, a technical instructor at Wenzhou South, Yao Xiaoqiang, reached the driver of train D301. D301, watch your running. There is a train in the section. There is 3115 in the section. Watch your running now, all right? Now the equipment. The report prints that much and marks the call cut off, unfinished. 33 seconds later, D301 hit the back of D3115 at 62 miles an hour, its driver, Pan Yiheng, braking. An hour earlier, the control center at Wenzhou South had found a fault in itself, said so, and gone on telling the railway the line ahead of D301 was empty. In a room at Wenzhou South Station stood a cabinet of electronics with a model number, LKD2T1. It was designed by a signaling research institute in Beijing and built by a manufacturer in Shanghai. Its job was to know where the trains were. Circuits in the rails detect whether a section is occupied, and the control center reads those circuits and does two things with the answer. It sets the line-side signals, and it sends codes into the rails for the train's own computer to obey. Chinese railway specifications govern how such a thing is allowed to fail, and the rule comes down to 6 characters. Guzhang Dao Xiang An Quan, fault guides toward safety. A signaling failure is permitted to hold a train that could safely have run. It is never permitted to release one that should have been held. The line was approved in March 2005 to carry passengers at 200 kilometers an hour. Construction started the following February. Then, in November 2008, with construction in its 3rd year, a letter from the ministry raised the opening speed to 250, about 155 miles an hour. It opened on the 28th of September 2009, 4 months early, and ran 175 miles from Ningbo down to Wenzhou. That evening there was lightning over the stretch that mattered, and the investigation measured it precisely. Between 27 and 34 minutes past 7, lightning struck the ground along the corridor around Wenzhou South more than 340 times, and 11 of those strikes carried a peak current above 100,000 amperes. The State Grid's Lightning Laboratory analyzed the data, and a China Meteorological Administration panel later checked it against a separate network. 2 trains were coming down the line underneath it. D3115 was running from Hangzhou to Fuzhou South, with 1,072 people aboard. Behind it came D301 out of Beijing South for Fuzhou, with 558 aboard, 36 minutes late. What failed at Wenzhou South starts 5 years earlier, with a tender. In September 2006, the Ministry of Railways put 2 lines out to competitive tender for their signaling and electrification. One package was Hefei to Wuhan, and it included Hefei Station itself. The other was Hefei to Nanjing, and it did not. 2 different consortia won them. The one that took Hefei to Wuhan chose a control center of its own group's design, talking between stations over 125 megabit fiber. The one that took Hefei to Nanjing chose a different manufacturer's on 100 megabit industrial Ethernet. The 2 lines meet at Hefei Station. The report states the consequence in 8 characters. They could not achieve communication with each other. Hefei Station had to open on the same day as the Hefei to Nanjing line. So on the 2nd of June, 2007, the ministry's passenger line technical department called a meeting. It ruled that the interface would use the 100 megabit Ethernet standard, the one belonging to the other consortium's line, and it required Hefei Station's control center equipment to be reselected to match. The next sentence in the report is the one this story hangs from. Thereafter it says, the Design Institute decided to begin developing the LKD2T1 train control center. A control center that already met the requirement existed. It was the one going into the line next door. Instead, a new piece of safety-critical equipment was designed, and designed quickly. By October 2007, it was being shipped to site for installation. In November, it went in front of the Ministry's Science and Technology Department for what the report is careful to call a technical pre-review. Apportioning blame, the report faults the Passenger Line Technical Department, the body that called the June meeting, for failing to notice the Design Institute's irregular conduct in changing the equipment type at Hefei. Irregular conduct. The investigation calls the substitution a violation. On the 21st of December 2007, the LKD-2T1 went into service at Hefei Station. The pre-review opinion that authorized trialing it was issued on the 26th of December 2007. Those two dates belong in that order. The equipment was carrying trains for 5 days before the document permitting it to be tried out existed. And what that document said when it arrived was that the system's functions should be continuously improved during field trials and in-service use. Improved while in service. Improved, that is, by whatever the service turned up. A system safety analysis of the accident by Erong Dong at MIT puts that policy in one sentence. Due to the tight schedule, it says, they thought problems and errors would be discovered and solved through incidents that occurred during the service run. From there, it spread, Hefei Station first. Then the entire Hefei to Wuhan line, which the report records the ministry's basic department agreeing to in violation of procedure, with no field testing done. Then, in April 2008, the winning bid for the Yong-Wen line specified the LKD-2T1 at 18 of its stations, equipment which had passed, in the report's phrase, only a technical pre-review. By July 2011, it was working at 58 stations and 18 relay stations on the Yong-Wen line, the Guangzhou to Zhuhai line, and the Hainan East Ring line. At Wenzhou South, it had been running for nearly 2 years. That is what a latent defect looks like from outside. It looks like a machine that works. Those strikes did the damage. Surge after surge reached the signaling cables, and under the repeated hammering, a fuse blew in the acquisition drive unit, rated at 250 volts and 5 amps. The report calls it fuse F2. At the moment F2 blew, there was no train in the blocks that Wenzhou South controlled. The lightning also degraded the bus carrying signals between the track circuits and the control center, and one circuit, 5829AG, began coding erratically. On the screen at Wenzhou South, that showed up as a red band across the approach. At 1939, the duty officer Zhang Kai saw the red band, telephoned the train dispatcher at Shanghai, Zhanghua, and called out the signaling and track staff. At 1940, Tang Ansi reached the traffic office, confirmed the fault was real, and wrote it in the register. By 5 to 8, an engineer named Chen Shujun and 2 colleagues were in the equipment room, finding 15 transmitters, 3 receivers, and an attenuator all showing red. At 7:54, Zhanghua noticed that the screen in Shanghai and the screen at the station did not agree with each other about the red band, and put 3 stations onto emergency station control. At 8:09, an assistant dispatcher named Yang Xiangming warned the driver of D3115, He Li, what to expect: a red band on the approach, a signal that could not be cleared, possibly a white light in the cab. And if the train was brought to a stand, switch to visual mode and carry on. He Li checked it back with Zhanghua. D3115 left. Yongjia at 8:14 and 58 seconds, and 2 minutes later, Zhanghua came back with a speed. If you meet a red in the section, switch to visual mode and proceed at under 12 miles an hour. At 8:21 and 22 seconds, the train entered the faulty circuit and its onboard protection system braked it automatically. 24 seconds later, it was standing still and it stayed there. 3 times the driver tried to switch to visual mode and start again. 3 times the erratic coding defeated the attempt. Between 8:22 and 22 seconds and 8:27 and 57 seconds, the driver called the dispatcher 6 times, and the station called the train 3 times. Not one of those 9 attempts connected. At 8:24 and 25 seconds, with the block system showing normal and every condition for a following movement satisfied, Zhanghua dispatched D301 out of Yongjia, in accordance with the rules. The report notes what else the dispatcher was doing. Between 8:17 and 8:24, after sending D3115 and before sending D301, Zhanghua checked the equipment at other stations, checked Wenzhou South again, looked into a 3rd train, and dispatched or received 8 trains. At 8:27 and 57 seconds, the station finally got through to He Li, who reported that the train was stopped, that the radio would not reach anyone, and that the coding kept jumping so visual mode would not take. At 8:29 and 26 seconds, after standing on the viaduct for 7 minutes and 40 seconds, D3115 moved off at under 12 miles an hour. 6 seconds later, the radio call. At 8:30 p.m., 5 seconds past the minute, at kilometer 583.831 on the Ujiang Bridge, D301 struck D3115. D301 was doing 62 miles an hour. D3115 was doing 10. The investigation confirmed that Pan Yiheng had applied the emergency brake. 7 vehicles came off the rails. 2 of the vehicles from D301 went over the side of a deck 57 feet above the ground. A third was left hanging over the edge, and the body of the leading carriage broke away from its running gear and fell. That running gear did not fall, but came down across the front half of car 16 of D3115, with the 5th carriage across the back of it. 40 people died. 37 were passengers and 3 were crew. 25 died where the trains came to rest. 13 died on the way to hospital, and 2 died later under treatment. The investigation put the injured at 172. A count of 191 went out in the first days, and a figure of at least 192 is still in circulation. The dead on D301 were spread through its first 4 carriages. D3115 lost nobody at all except in its last 2. 20 of the 40 died in car 16, the carriage with running gear lying across one end of it and a carriage across the other. The first people into the wreckage lived there. Villagers from Xiaoao went down to the carriages that had fallen off the bridge and started pulling people out, and one of them called the police 40 seconds after the impact. On the trains, crew were organizing passengers to get each other free. The fire companies arrived at 8:42 and 8:44 p.m., and the report counts what they took out one carriage at a time. More than 3,000 police and firefighters came, more than 200 garrison troops, more than 1,400 medical staff, and more than 1,300 local people who turned up on their own. 260 were brought out alive. At 5:30 the next morning, on the ground under the bridge, officials of the Shanghai Railway Bureau organized the digging of a pit. They were doing it, in the report's own words, simply according to the way accident sites had been dealt with in the past. The damaged power car and the parts scattered around it were to be buried where they lay, and they were placed into the pit. Then, the report says, it was stopped by leading comrades. At 11:10 a.m., the vice premier, Zhang Dezhang, arrived at Wenzhou, visited the injured, and looked over the site. On seeing train wreckage piled inside a pit, Zhang gave an instruction the report quotes directly. The wreckage cannot be buried. Site protection must be done properly and the accident vehicles preserved properly to provide the conditions for investigation and analysis. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, up on the bridge, a crane lifted the running gear of D301's first carriage off the top of car 16 of D3115. Rescuers went straight in and brought out 7 bodies, and then they found a child pinned under a luggage rack. At 5:15 p.m., a small girl named Xiang Wei was lifted alive out of the carriage where 20 people had died and taken to hospital. The report puts the damaged power car and the scattered parts at Wenzhou West Station that night under guard at 10 o'clock on the 25th. The equipment did not fail quietly. When fuse F2 blew, the acquisition drive unit detected that its own circuit had failed. It generated a fault message, and it sent that message to the main unit of the control center. It then went on transmitting the last picture of the track it had captured before it broke. The main unit received the fault message. It forwarded that message to the monitoring and maintenance terminal. It took no protective action of any kind, and it carried on setting signal aspects and track circuit codes from the frozen picture the drive unit kept sending it. The frozen picture showed an empty line. So when D3115 came to a stand in section 5829 AG, the control center could not see it. The signals protecting that section and the 2 sections beyond it stayed green, and into the rails went the code that means no train occupying, and D301 read that code and came on. The report has a term for what those signals did. It says they wrongly upgraded. A signal upgrades when it rises to a less restrictive aspect, and stopping it from doing that is the whole purpose of the fail-safe rule. Underneath the software, there were two hardware faults. The PIO acquisition supply had a single independent feed where the rules required two, so when F2 went, every PIO board in the cabinet lost its acquisition supply at once. And both input paths were taken from one source point, which meant the equipment could not compare them against each other. It had no way to check itself against itself. These two hardware design defects, the report concludes, caused the equipment not to meet the safety protection requirement. Why nobody found this before it reached a viaduct is set out just as plainly. The development was done, in the report's word, hastily. No formal design team was organized. People were assigned to it verbally. The documentation was irregular and some of it missing. There was no comprehensive review of the equipment, least of all of the PIO board. And there was no single board fault test, the test that finds a board that fails without failing safe. The report is dated the 25th of December 2011. The crash it found was a liability accident caused by serious design defects in the control center equipment, by lax gatekeeping over its approval for the line, and by inadequate emergency handling after lightning caused it to fail. Of the Ministry of Railways, it said it had rushed construction periods, chased progress, and pursued construction speed one-sidedly. Which brings us back to the pit. Images of excavators working over the wreckage went round the world that week, and that is the picture the coverage has carried since. The record underneath it does not agree with itself. The State Council report says a pit was dug, that the power car and the loose parts were placed in it, that the burial was stopped, and that in the end, they were not buried. It puts them under guard at Wenzhou West Station at 10 o'clock on the night of the 25th. State media reported something else. On the 27th of July, China's state broadcaster published Xinhua's account of the clearance. Work began about 10:30 on the night of the 25th. The last convoy of power car remains left about 9:30 the following night, and the D301 power car, in its words previously buried, was dug out and taken away. The remains were caked in earth. 5 excavators stayed behind to backfill the pits. 2 accounts of the same ground, describing events a day apart. The digging itself is not in dispute. The report records it. The report also states that by the time the pit was dug, the search beneath the bridge was finished and the evidence collected. That finding has no source outside the document making it, and the document is the investigating state examining its own railway bureau. The report does not defend the act. Its own summary of the emergency response says the pit, though stopped, produced a bad effect in society. The justification given at the time was mud. Wang Yongping, the ministry's spokesman, relayed the explanation given on landing at Wenzhou. The ground under the bridge was a mire, working there was awkward, and the power car had been covered over mainly to make the rescue easier. Then came one more sentence, added unprompted, and by Wang Yongping's own account 4 years later, it was offered to win the room's trust. As for whether you believe it, I at any rate believe it. One more correction sits in the report unnoticed by the field. It was reported at the time that the search had been called off after 8 hours and 6 sweeps, and the report records the public doubt that followed. The investigation traced it to a commander describing one part of the operation, the ground under the bridge. The search up on the bridge was still going on. No one, the report states, ever issued an order to stop the rescue, and Xiang Weiyi came out of car 16 at 5:15 that afternoon, 20 hours and 45 minutes after the impact. Both of those things are true. The people on duty that night were found at fault. The dispatcher for not learning more and not warning D301. The station duty officer for not keeping radio contact with D301 either. The signaling staff for swapping equipment out without registering it first. Of the dispatcher, although they did not know about the signal upgrading, they failed to find out more. Of the station duty officer, although they did not know about the signal upgrading, they failed to follow the standards. Of the signaling staff, although they did not know about the signal upgrading, they failed to carry out their duties properly. Dong's analysis says what they believed instead. Both the dispatcher and the station operator, it concludes, must have assumed the failed system was still fail-safe, that if the following train got too close, the machine would stop it. The two drivers got a different verdict. He Li, of D3115, had license, rest, paperwork, and breath test all in order, and the investigation found the handling of that train between Yongjia and Wenzhou South compliant with the standards. It found the same of Pan Yiheng, of D301, who qualified in June 2009, who braked, and who is recorded in the report as having died in the line of duty. The ministry was told to put the LKD2T1 right. It was corrected at 58 stations and 18 relay stations across 3 railways, and the work was finished on the 19th of August, 2011. That was 27 days after the crash. The same shape on another railway is on this channel, Clapham Junction, where a wire that had been left long enough to touch its old terminal turned a signal into something that could not go red. The LKD2T1 went into service at Hefei Station on the 21st of December, 2007. The document saying it could be tried out was issued 5 days later, on the 26th. It was still running on 3 railways 3.5 years after that, on the night it went on setting green over a block with a train standing in it.